Hello comrades, yes, I'm back, which is hopefully good news for a lot of people. Have no fear, MI5 have not kidnapped me just yet. FBI, open up! So today's video is going to be on spontaneity and identity politics, or IdPol as it's sometimes referred to. While I've been away since my last video, and the reason why I haven't posted much on the channel was because even though we're still in the lockdown because of COVID-19, I've been busier than ever at work, because I used to be a cleaner. Now, the reason why I put it like that is because I've recently just changed jobs to work in a petrol station in my local town, so now is really the only chance I've had to use some time to make a video on something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. Now, the reason why I'm going to talk about spontaneity and identity politics in particular is not just because these two things are quite predominant features here in the West, but also because of how these two things can be intertwined with the class struggle that's going on. And when it comes to IdPol, I'm really just going to give my own take on the subject, because I know that a lot of communists are very divided over this subject. But without further ado, I'm just going to go straight into it. So, identity politics, or IdPol, if you're watching this right now and you're not so familiar with the term and what it means, then I'll just give you a brief description of what it is, or at least what I would understand it to be. So rather than focusing on an ideology specifically, identity politics, well, it's in the name really, it's basically politics surrounding someone's identity. So, for example, it would be politics surrounding people who are gay, or transgender, or black, or white. Now, examples of groups that actually do identity politics and are quite heavily invested in IdPol would be the LGBT community and Black Lives Matter. Groups like these are fighting for good causes, and causes which communists should be supporting. You know, the LGBT community struggles for the civil rights of gay people, trans people and so forth, whilst Black Lives Matter are fighting against police brutality against innocent black people and innocent people in general. But there is obviously a problem here when it comes to identity politics, because what I've noticed is that a lot of Marxist-Leninists in particular are very divided. From what I've experienced, I have seen two factions of Marxist-Leninists when it comes to identity politics. First of all, there are the Marxist-Leninists who basically reject all forms of identity politics, so they pretty much look at groups who defend and fight for the rights of trans people, gay people, non-binary people, black people or women, and turn up their noses at them as if to say, nah, fuck that. And their justification for doing this is that the groups who are doing IdPol are somehow not revolutionary. I kid you not, I have seen some fellow Marxist-Leninists actually doing this, and an example of a Marxist-Leninist organization I've actually seen doing this is the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist, otherwise known as the cpgb-ml. If you want the full story of what happened, Bad Mouse Productions did a video on this in which he gave an excellent critique of the cpgb-ml stance on identity politics, but I will give you a brief summary of what happened anyway. Basically what happened was that back in 2018, things started kicking off on Twitter when the cpgb-ml replied to an article by the Red Fight Back, claiming that they were fighting against reality itself. When I first saw this, I thought it was a bit weird. Then, the same year, the Central Committee of the party passed a new motion in their 8th Congress which basically rejected identity politics entirely, and the party started becoming incredibly hostile to the LGBT community in particular, calling them anti-working class and all sorts. It even got to the point where many of their younger members, some of whom were actually part of the LGBT community, ended up leaving the party after being, well, insulted by the condescending and pretty reactionary positions being held by members of the Central Committee, some of which include the real dinosaur perspective that being gay somehow separates you from wanting to have children. If this isn't a direct violation of the old quote by Karl Marx, which reads, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it," then I don't know what is. This is alongside the party also building an imaginary caricature of the proletariat, as in telling working people to wear clothes and hairstyles that make them look like they're living in the 1950s, because it somehow looks working class. If you ask me, this is not a very materialist thing to do at all, because what makes you part of the working class is if you have to sell your labor power to the bourgeoisie in order to have an income, since you have no ownership over the means of production. So basically, you have to find a job and pretty much accept the fact that the conditions of your employment mean that you will end up producing more wealth for the capitalist than what you get paid as wages. It's basically your relationship to the means of production that determines your class, not your hairstyle or what clothes you wear. So when I came across the news of the cpgb-ml's 8th Congress, as well as the news of the huge amount of casual homophobia and transphobia within the Central Committee, I'm not gonna lie, it did leave me very unnerved, because not only do I have very good friends who happen to be part of the LGBT community, but I also used to be very close to the cpgb-ml and was even considering joining them and getting involved in the party because of how much I really liked their no bullshit approach to class struggle, as I like to call it. But unfortunately, the events that have been unfolding have really made me step back and self-criticize to the point where I've started sailing away from the cpgb-ml altogether. Right now, I've pretty much defected to the CPB, or the Communist Party of Britain, who are often slandered by the cpgb-ml as being reformists or Trotskyists. But after looking into their political program and also speaking to some of their members, I've come to realize that the slanders of the cpgb-ml against the CPB, well, dare I say it, they're a load of bollocks. The youth wing of the British Communist Party, in particular, known as the YCL, or the Young Communist League, they have done some amazing work in organising on the streets to set up food banks. They also work among the trade union movement in Britain, and they hold study sessions for young people to help them better understand Marxist-Leninist theory. Now, if you are interested, I would highly recommend checking out their political programme, and even having a look at their website. Alongside the one faction of Marxist-Leninists who reject all forms of identity politics and label it as being non-revolutionary and reactionary, there's also the other faction of Marxist-Leninists who decide to look into IdPol but end up becoming a full-on radical liberal. If you're not very familiar with Radical-Liberalism, it's basically a belief that is quite prevalent in a lot of left-wing circles here in the West. It basically looks at capitalism and gives solutions that have absolutely no basis in scientific socialism, because it relies heavily on moral arguments to try and guilt-trip the masses rather than to try and help the masses recognize their own self-interest in struggling for socialism. Now, the reason why this camp is also wrong is because capitalist academia and the mainstream bourgeois media these days, they both promote radical liberal ideology. Now, the reason for this is because radical liberalism basically tries to push this erroneous idea that identity-based issues are not caused by class antagonisms. It basically pushes the idea that building workers' power and engaging in the class struggle is not the solution to the problems inherent to capitalism. So as opposed to being about class struggle, radical liberalism basically takes the form of race or gender-based essentialism. Therefore, although it may very well arise from very legitimate grievances against the oppression of minorities, radical liberalism is wrong because it puts the blame of the existing problems, all caused by capitalism, onto, say, white people or men or straight people, as opposed to the bourgeoisie as a class and the institutions that serve them. Now, I can understand that white people, straight people, men and people who are not trans, they might not go through the same sort of lived experiences as women or black people, or what trans people or gay people go through. But what does need to be addressed here is that the average white worker or the average working man or the average straight worker, they are not the ones profiting from the system. They are not really the problem. So when it comes to identity politics, there is obviously a problem here, but this problem is not identity politics itself. The problem is actually liberalism. And the reason why this is the case is because liberals totally ignore class. But by completely rejecting the struggles of women, the LGBT community, Black Lives Matter, and other sorts of civil rights groups, that's not going to do anything apart from make this IdPol problem even worse. This is not me saying that identity-based struggles have played no significant role in history, because they clearly have. I mean, look at the Stonewall riots. That's basically the reason why Pride exists. The civil rights movement that stood up to fight for equality for black people in the US is another good example of an identity-based issue that has played a significant role in history. So what I'm saying is that rather than totally rejecting the struggles of groups who do identity politics, communists should first of all recognize that these struggles have risen from very legitimate grievances against problems that are all connected to capitalist society, and they should then take these struggles, link them together, and bring them into the class struggle. Because if you're a communist, if you're a Marxist, then straight away that means that you actually want equality for everybody. But as Marxists, we're also materialists. So this equality should also be extended to economics and politics as well. Like, have a little think about it. You can't have democracy and equality if the capitalists are still controlling everything. The thing that liberals always seem to forget is that capitalism does not promote equality. A big multinational, for example, would only ever tell you that they're against racism simply because it's good for business. Not because they genuinely want to show solidarity with the oppressed and the victims of the very system that the owners of that company profit from. The class struggle and building a socialist society to work towards communism, where the only thing that matters is your relationship to the means of production, so your class. That is the way you build the conditions to promote genuine equality, not some symbolic advertisement with a little trademark all over it. So, identity politics only really goes so far, and this is what liberals totally forget. For instance, a woman who is a CEO of a multinational corporation is not in the same position as a woman who is a worker on minimum wage, struggling to put food on the table and keep a roof over her head. In terms of identity, yeah, maybe both women may face harassment and stuff like that, but in terms of class, the woman who is a CEO and the woman who is a worker, they are not in the same boat at all. In fact, the working women have far more in common with working men when you bring class into it. The bourgeoisie is just as much of an enemy to working women, trans workers, gay workers and non-binary workers as they are to working men. So whilst there are definitely certain types of oppressions that people face because of their identity, this only really goes so far, since if you're wealthy enough and powerful enough, it doesn't really matter anymore. Only a liberal would just take someone who is gay or a woman or black and then just ignore everything else. Marxists don't do that, or at least they shouldn't do that. So to move on to another subject of spontaneity, because there is a link between spontaneity and identity politics, while it's very true that movements that do IdPol are largely not very politically conscious at all, what communists should recognize, especially Marxist-Leninists, what we should recognize is that this is a very good reason to try and befriend them in order to help them along the right track. A lot of these movements are mainly driven by spontaneity rather than ideology. So what I'm saying is that we've actually got to go in there and combat that, because if we just leave these movements to be dominated by liberals, that will just make things worse. Therefore, if you're seeking to crush capitalism and build a completely new socialist society to actually facilitate real economic and political change and to grant minorities with the equality that they're fighting for, the working class needs a party of its own to lead and guide them, and the party should also learn from the workers too. And of course, this takes consistency, which spontaneous mass movements don't generally have. I mean, as an example, look at the Black Lives Matter protests that happened last year. It was a perfect example of a spontaneous outburst of angry workers, but this mass movement fizzled out incredibly quickly, and the reason for this was because it was a spontaneous mass movement that was very loosely organized with absolutely no clear and consistent political goals. Hence the reason why I'm saying that Marxist-Leninists should really be giving assistance to spontaneous movements who are fighting for good causes, like the LGBT community and Black Lives Matter, because it's during these spontaneous outbursts that such a perfect opportunity is presented to actually go in there and introduce people in these groups to the ideological side of things. As Stalin said, quote, "The theory of worshipping spontaneity is decidedly opposed to the revolutionary character of the working class movement. It is opposed to the movement taking the line of struggle against the foundations of capitalism." Close quote. Now granted, a serious Communist Party won't spend a huge amount of time on the issues of identity politics, but it would recognise the overlaps between identity politics and class politics, especially when addressing the problems of spontaneity caused by liberalism, which have in turn caused many other comrades to become so hostile to identity politics and groups who are quite heavily invested in it. So I don't think it would hurt to have a small committee in a Communist Party built especially for LGBT folks or Black Lives Matter, where members can basically dedicate some time to that. However, the primary issues that a Communist Party will address will be the class issues, because it is the class issues that go on to affect the secondary issues, which are the identity-based issues like racism, gender inequality, discrimination against LGBT folks, etc. For example, look at what the Bolsheviks did. They had special committees within their party that were dedicated to looking at the national oppression of all the different cultural and ethnic minorities living in Tsarist Russia, and they managed to integrate that into the class struggle that was going on. The Black Panthers in the United States also did something very similar to this by looking at the class struggle going on in the country and then basically applying this analysis to the civil rights movement, the Black liberation struggle, and even the struggle for decolonization.
Антисемитизмом называется распространение вражды к евреям. Когда проклятая царская монархия доживала свое последнее время, она старалась натравить темных рабочих и крестьян на евреев. Царская полиция в союзе с помещиками и капиталистами устраивала еврейские погромы. Ненависть измученных нуждой рабочих и крестьян помещики и капиталисты старались направить на евреев. И в других странах приходится видеть нередко, что капиталисты разжигают вражду к евреям, чтобы засорить глаза рабочих, чтобы отвлечь их взоры от настоящего врага трудящихся, от капитала. Вражда к евреям держится прочно только там, где кабала помещиков и капиталистов создала беспросветную темноту рабочих и крестьян. Только совсем темные, совсем забитые люди могут верить лжи и клевете, распространяемой против евреев. Это остатки старого, крепостного времени, когда попы заставляли сжигать еретиков на кострах, когда существовало рабство крестьян, когда народ был задавлен и безгласен. Эта старая крепостническая темнота проходит. Народ становится зрячим. Не евреи враги трудящих, враги рабочих, капиталисты всех стран. Среди евреев есть рабочие, труженики, их большинство. Они наши братья по угнетению капиталом, наши товарищи по борьбе за социализм. Среди евреев есть кулаки, эксплуататоры, капиталисты, как и среди русских, так и среди всех наций. Капиталисты стараются посеять и разжечь вражду между рабочими разной веры, разной нации, разной расы. На розни рабочих держится сила и власть капитала. Богатые евреи, как и богатые русские, как и богачи всех стран, в союзе друг с другом давят, гнетут, грабят, разъединяют рабочих. Позор проклятому царизму, мучившему и преследовавшему евреев. Позор тем, кто сеет вражду к евреям, кто сеет ненависть к другим нациям. Да здравствует братское доверие и боевой союз рабочих всех наций в борьбе за свержение капитала.
What makes them mad about it? What makes them mad about it is that they had black people and white poor people and red poor people and Puerto Rican poor people and Latin American Puerto Rican people of poor people of all descents. They had them caught up in movements based on racism when the Black Panther Party stood up and said that we don't care what anybody says. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We said we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. We stood up and said we're not going to fight reactionary pigs and reactionary state attorneys like this and reactionary state attorneys like Hanrahan with any other reactions on our part. We're going to fight their reactions where all of us people are getting together and have an international proletarian revolution. Right on. Right on. And that's saying all power to the people. Right on. That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes. And that's saying there's a class over here and there's a class over there. And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off its back, because this is lower, this is upper. This is the oppressed, this is the oppressor. This is the exploited, this is the exploiter. And these people in this class have divided themselves. They say, I'm black and I hate white people. I'm white and I hate black people. I'm Latin American and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly, I hate Indians. So we fighting amongst each other. And you've heard the testimony of pigs here. You got pigs of all colors, you know that. You got pigs that are white, you got pigs that are black, you even got pigs that are black and white. Propagating the same type of madness that this buffoon Henry had would be propagating if he were here himself. And why? Because they want to keep you to believing that I'm your enemy, and that everybody else that's black and that wears a lot of hair on his head and hair on his face, they want to keep you thinking that he's your enemy. Why? Because if ever you would disregard him and overlook him just for a minute and throw away that question of racism and start dealing with a little logic, then there would be no one else you could attack other than Henry Hand, other than Davy, and other than Tricky Dicky Nixon. If you make the right decision, then the oppressed people of the world will get complete satisfaction. I know you return a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
So just to make myself absolutely clear, when I said that the working class needs a party of its own, it should be pointed out that this party should not be a small conspiratorial organization. Instead, it should be a popular mass movement with clear political goals that uses both vanguardism and democratic centralism to organize the masses. This is to avoid the movement fading away, and historically this has been the most suitable method within communist parties in actually making a revolution happen, because I will be brutally honest with you, organizing a revolution is not an easy thing to do. It requires a shit ton of planning because you're basically destroying the old structure and building a completely different society with totally different relations in production, economics, culture, politics, the lot. And a socialist revolution is even more unique than any of the other great revolutions that have happened through history. So unlike the French Revolution or the American War of Independence, a socialist revolution is a revolution of the working class that marks the beginning of the end of all class antagonisms. It's not a revolution where one class of an exploiting category is replaced by another, like the bourgeois revolutions of the Enlightenment were. It's a revolution of the oppressed, the robbed and the poor. So while spontaneous popular movements like Black Lives Matter and the LGBT community are very good to a degree, as they do allow for revolutionary movements to introduce them to ideology and consistent leadership, the only real problem with these spontaneous popular movements is the very fact that they are spontaneous. Hence the reason why I hold the position that Marxist-Leninists should be forming alliances with these groups. That way it essentially allows for political consciousness to be integrated with these movements for civil rights. So rather than casting them out, Marxist-Leninists should really be bringing them into the class struggle, because that is really the only way that equality is going to be achieved. So to conclude, I don't think the problem here is identity politics, the problem is liberalism. Liberals, and I've also seen anarchists doing this as well, they tend to romanticize spontaneous popular movements, and of course it all just inevitably leads to more aimless spontaneity. And it's because of this that the bourgeoisie then often steps in, acquires these genuine struggles for civil rights, and then just commodifies them to suit their interests. This is what brings me to the final quote to end the video, and this quote is by Lenin. It can be found in chapter 2 of his work, What is to be Done. And I think this quote basically summarizes what I've just said about liberals who ignore class and basically just do nothing but feed into the spontaneity problem that plagues many civil rights movements that do identity politics. Quote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. To belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology." Close quote.